You may have heard the term histogram and be wondering exactly what it means. In Photoshop, the histogram is a panel that contains a bar chart that represents the distribution of tones in an image. If you know how to read a histogram, it can be useful when you're correcting colors and tones in a photograph. In this movie, I'm going to explain how the histogram works in Photoshop and show you some examples of photographs that have different kinds of histograms. If your histogram panel isn't open, go to the window menu at the top of the screen and choose Histogram. Or you can change to the Color and Tone workspace, as I've done here, from the Workspace menu. I usually go to the Panel menu on the histogram and change it from its default Compact View to Expanded View. Right now, the histogram is showing us information about all the color channels in this special Colors view. To make it easier to read, I'm going to change the channel menu there to look at an RGB composite view. So what is the histogram? As I mentioned, it's a bar chart that represents the distribution of tones in the open image. The left side of the chart represents the darkest tones in an image. The right side of the chart represents the brightest tones in an image. And the area between represents all the possible gray tones in an image. This black mound here represents the actual tonal values in the open photograph. If you could pull this mound apart, you'd see that it's made up of individual vertical bars. Each of those bars is above a particular point on the graph. Where there's a tall bar, that means there's a relatively large amount of that particular tone in the image. And where there are no bars, that means there's none of that particular tone. Every photograph will have a different histogram. You don't always want a histogram that looks like this, but many photographs do look best if they have a wide range of tones. Those photographs, like this one, will have a histogram that runs across the entire histogram panel. But let's take a look at some other kinds of photographs and their histograms. I'm going to click on the second tab that I have open here, the over.psd image. You can see by looking at it that this is a very bright image. If you look at the histogram for this photograph, you'll see that all of its tones are indeed over at the white side of the bar graph. There are very few grays and no blacks at all. Let's look at the clipped.psd image. The foreground of this photograph looks fine, but as you can see, many of the clouds are pure white, lacking in detail. That's represented on this histogram by this spike on the far right. If you have a spike in an image, that's usually not a good thing because it means you have lost detail, either in the highlights if the spike is there, or in the shadows if the spike is over here. You'll notice something else in this histogram. There's a yellow triangle here. That means that the histogram has changed and needs to be updated. You'll see this in the histogram panel when you make an adjustment to an image. To update the histogram, you can click on this double curved arrow, and the yellow warning symbol will go away. Let's take a look at a really dark image. Its histogram is located primarily in the dark area, but there is a lot of middle gray too. If you'll notice in the Layers panel, there are two layers in this image. The top layer is composed only of this dark bank building. I can set the histogram to show me just the tones in a single selected layer by going to its Source menu and choosing Selected Layer instead of Entire Image. Watch how the histogram changes when I do that. Now, as expected, we see that all of the pixels are over on the left side, representing just the dark pixels in the bank layer. I'd like to show you one more image, and that is this one, flat.psd. I find the histogram particularly useful on an image like this, because when I look at it, I can see that it doesn't look very good, but I'm not necessarily sure how to fix it. It helps me to see in the histogram that all of the pixels in this image are concentrated in the gray tones in the middle. That means it doesn't have much contrast. In other words, it doesn't have white whites and black blacks. So if I wanted to correct this image, I'd probably do a levels or a curves adjustment, trying to expand this tonal range and get some whites and blacks and different shades of gray into the photograph. The histogram really is a useful tool that can help you to analyze an image when you're beginning to edit it and to understand what your edits are doing as you make them. Now that you've seen a few examples of different kinds of photographs and their histograms, I hope you'll be better able to read the histograms on your own images. When you're correcting colors or tones in your photographs, the best way to work is to apply adjustment layers rather than to apply direct adjustments. Adjustment layers are preferable because they won't permanently change the pixels in your photographs. Another benefit of adjustment layers is that they remain editable, so you can come back at any time, even after you've saved and closed a file, and tweak the adjustments that you've made. In Photoshop Cs4, adjustments have gotten even better. because now there's a separate panel, the Adjustments panel, from which you can apply and manage your adjustment layers. My Adjustments panel is open over here. If yours isn't open, you can open it from the Window menu at the top of the screen. There are two main sections to this panel. In the top portion are icons that represent all of the available adjustment layers. If I click here, I'll apply a brightness contrast adjustment layer. Here, a levels adjustment layer, a curves adjustment layer. Down here is a black and white adjustment layer, a hue saturation adjustment layer, a vibrance adjustment layer, and more. We'll be looking at some of these in detail in other movies. For now, I'd like you to see how the Adjustments panel works and get a sense of the benefits of using adjustment layers. The bottom part of the Adjustments panel consists of presets for each of the kinds of adjustment layers. We'll take a closer look there in a minute, but first let's go ahead and apply an adjustment layer. This photo is a little dark, so I'm going to start with a brightness contrast adjustment layer right here. I'll click that icon, and two things happen. First, the Adjustments panel changes to show me just the controls for the brightness contrast adjustment. And second, down in the Layers panel, you'll see a new brightness contrast adjustment layer. An adjustment layer looks a little different than other kinds of layers. It has this adjustment icon on the left, and it comes with its own layer mask. In another movie, I'll show you how to use that layer mask to control the areas where an adjustment appears and where it's hidden. For now, let's go up to the Adjustments panel, and I'll work with these two sliders. The brightness slider darkens the photo if I pull it to the left, and brightens the photo if I go to the right. I'm going to brighten this photo a bit, and you'll notice that the histogram in the panel above changed when I made that adjustment. I use the histogram panel as a guide. For example, if I go too far with the brightness adjustment, I'll see a spike over here on the right side of the histogram. That'll tell me that I went too far, and I'll back off a little on the adjustment. In the brightness contrast adjustment panel, I also can adjust contrast, lowering contrast by pulling to the left, or increasing contrast by pulling to the right. You can have more than one adjustment layer on an image. So let's go back to the Adjustments panel in its initial state and add another adjustment layer. To do that, I'll click this green arrow at the bottom of the Adjustments panel. That takes me back to the initial view, and from here I'm going to click on another adjustment layer icon, the black and white adjustment icon right here. You can see that the Adjustments panel is now replaced with all the controls for the black and white adjustment. And in the Layers panel, there's a second adjustment layer, a black and white adjustment layer. I'll leave the controls in the black and white adjustment layer at their default for now. As you can see, the image has changed to black and white. I'm going to leave all these controls at their defaults for now. And I'm going to go back in and assume that I'm working elsewhere in my image, making other adjustments and tweaks. And then say that I decide that I don't like the way the black and white adjustment is, I would like to change it a little. At any time, I can come back and just click on that black and white adjustment layer, and my controls come up to the same settings as I left them. At this point, I can change the adjustment however I like. I could move any of these sliders, or I could just come up and click Tint, and that will change the black and white look of the image to a tinted or colorized look. I did that because I want to show you the preview icons at the bottom of the Adjustments panel. If I click this eye icon, I'm taken all the way back to before I applied any black and white adjustments. I'll turn that back on to show you the next icon here. If I click on this icon and hold, I get a preview of the last state of the black and white adjustment. And if I want to return to the last state of this adjustment, I click the next icon, and I go back to before I added the tint. If I want to delete the black and white adjustment completely, I can click this trash can, and I can click Yes in this dialog box, and the black and white adjustment layer disappears from the Layers panel. I'd like to show you one more thing about the Adjustments panel, so I'm going to go back to its initial view by clicking this large green arrow, and I wanted to show you how easy it is to apply an adjustment layer preset. Let's say that I think I need a little more contrast in this image. I can just click on the arrow to the left of Levels Presets, scroll down this list of available presets, and choose the one that I want. I'm going to try Increase Contrast 2. That did increase the contrast in the image. It also opened the levels controls here in the adjustments panel, and it added a levels adjustment layer in my layers panel. At this point, I could come up to this menu at the top of the levels adjustments panel, and I could choose a different preset. They appear here as well as in the initial adjustments panel. Or I could leave things as they are, or I could tweak these adjustments as necessary. I'm going to leave them as they are for now, and recommend again that when you need to adjust your photographs, you turn to adjustment layers rather than direct adjustments. When you use adjustment layers, you can feel confident that you're preserving your original image and that you can come back at any time and tweak or even delete your adjustment. Almost every image can benefit from a levels adjustment. When you adjust levels, you're remapping the darkest tones in an image to pure black and the brightest tones to pure white. That causes all the gray tones in between to be stretched out across the range between the whites and the blacks. The result is an image with more contrast between darks and lights and a wide distribution of gray tones in between, which usually makes a photo look better. Now, adjusting levels often does impact the colors in an image, but in this movie, I'm not focusing on adjusting color. Rather, I'm looking at adjusting tones in a color image. To get a sense of what tones are if you're not already sure, try this high-tech technique. Squint your eyes and focus on the photograph you see here, and try to see just the dark, light, and gray shading rather than the color. Those are the tones that I'm talking about in this movie. As with all the image adjustments that I'm covering, I strongly recommend that you apply levels as an adjustment layer rather than as a direct adjustment, because as you know from other movies, an adjustment layer is non-destructive of the image pixels, and it can always be re-edited. In Photoshop CS4, you can create a levels adjustment layer not only from the layer menu at the top of the screen up here, as you always have been able to, but, and this is the new piece, from the adjustments panel. If your adjustments panel isn't open, then you can open it from the window menu at the top of the screen. And when you're ready to create a new levels adjustment layer, you'll go to this second icon right here and click. That causes two things to happen. Down in the layers panel, you can see the new levels adjustment layer floating above the background photo layer. And in the adjustments panel, you see all of the controls for levels. Notice that there's a histogram inside the levels adjustments panel, and it looks just like the histogram up here in the histogram panel. In fact, they are the same. But the reason that I like to have the histogram panel open also is that the histogram in the levels adjustments panel doesn't update as I make changes to it, like the histogram panel does. So I use the histogram panel to check my work as I'm doing it in the levels adjustments panel. The levels histogram, just like the one in the histogram panel, is a bar chart of the 256 potential grayscale values that an 8-bit image can have. In the levels panel, you actually can see those tones represented here in this gradient. And if you could push this gradient up underneath the chart, it would be even easier to see that the far left of the chart represents the blackest blacks, the far right of the chart represents whitest whites, and in between are all the gray values. The black mound in the middle represents the actual tones in this open image. It's not really a mound, it's a collection of vertical bars squeezed up next to one another. Each bar represents the prevalence of a particular shade of gray in this image. The tall bars here mean that there's a relatively large amount of that particular shade of gray, which would be represented here on the bar chart. The short bars, like those over here, mean that there's very little of that particular shade in this image. So in this case, there's very little dark shades and almost no white shades, except for maybe those represented by the short spike, which I believe are these specular highlights right here. These we really don't care about when we're doing a levels adjustment, because by nature, they're always pure white. My goal when adjusting the levels in this image is to take that mound and stretch it out so it reaches further across this bar chart, and also to make sure that there are some white whites and some black blacks, and that there is detail in the light and dark areas at either end of the tonal curve. So to adjust the levels, all I have to do is come into the adjustments panel and take this white slider here and drag it in toward the left until it just touches these short bars. What that does is take any pixels that are to the right of that slider and push them to pure white with no detail. So that's why I don't want to go too far into this mound, because if I do, I'm taking all the pixels represented by the bars to the right of this and making them pure white, so that there isn't enough detail in the image. I'm going to pull that slider back to the right, because the question is, well, how far in should I go? And the way that I can tell is by holding down the Option key on my Mac or the Alt key on a PC as I drag that slider in, and looking for little patches of color. There I can see a little bit of red color there, and that represents some pixels that are starting to go pure white. The bright white pixels at the bottom right corner are the ones that represent the specular highlights, and I'm not really worried about those going white. Now I'm going to go over to the other side of the chart and grab the black slider, and I'm going to hold down my Option key again and drag to the right so I can see where to stop with that slider. I also want to put this one just under the mound of pixels. Now you can see a big blue patch on the left that is pure blue. Those are pixels that are pure black, and they came in like that from the digital camera. They're represented by the black spike on the far left of the chart. I'm just going to let those stay pure black because I think it fits in fine with the design. And I'm more interested in these other blue pixels, so when I just see a few of those, I'll release my mouse, and that's my initial levels adjustment. The other thing I want to do is come to the gray slider in the middle and drag that to the right to darken the entire image. And that happens without disturbing the new black and white points, which I just set. Now, if you look in the histogram above, you'll see that the mound has spread out so that you can see gaps in between the vertical bars. This is because the tones in the image have now been spread out across the entire tonal range, which is what I wanted. And I think the image looks better. Sometimes it's hard to see small differences in brightness and contrast. So at this point, I'll go down to the bottom of the Adjustments panel, and I'll click this preview icon right here, holding it so I can see how the image looked when I started. It had this kind of gray, dull film over it, as compared to now, when it pops with contrast and brightness. Because I made this adjustment as an adjustment layer, I can come in and change it at any time. So if I were working on another layer, like this background layer, and I wanted to come in and tweak the levels adjustment, I could just click on the Levels 1 adjustment layer and come back in and move those sliders however I wanted them to be. And I can do that at any time, even after I save and close the image and reopen it. A couple more things to show you here. There are presets for levels. They are located back in the Adjustments panel or here in the Custom menu at the top of the screen. So you can try those out if you want, as opposed to creating a custom levels adjustment as I just showed you how to do. And there's also an auto button here. I avoid the auto button. In the levels adjustment panel, the auto button sometimes results in a color cast because it adjusts each color channel individually. So for example, if I click auto here, you can see a faint magenta cast in the image. So I'll press undo, that's Command Z on a Mac, Control Z on a PC, to go back to my good levels adjustment. That's the basic technique for adding contrast and brightness to an image with levels. You've given the image some true black and white tones and stretched out the gray tones in between, eliminating the dull look that was caused by a lack of optimum contrast. Sure, there's more you could do to the image now. You might add a hue saturation adjustment layer or some color adjustments, but you certainly have improved the basic tonal structure of the image by applying levels. There's a brand new panel in Photoshop Cs4 called the Masks panel. You can use this panel to help you to create masks, to refine their edges, and to control the density or the strength of the mask on an image. You can use the Masks panel with any kind of mask, a layer mask, a vector mask, but where it really shines is when you're using it with an adjustment layer mask to limit the area where the adjustment shows up in your image. I introduced this subject in an earlier movie. Now I want to add this additional piece, which is using the Masks panel with adjustment layer masks. Take a look at this photo. It's a typical backlit photo. I shot it into the sun so the camera exposed for the sky. And now the foreground needs some tonal adjustments. It needs some whites, some blacks, and a range of grays in between. But the background is probably okay as is. So what I'm going to want to do is apply a levels adjustment layer to this image but prevent that adjustment from affecting the sky. I'm going to be using a levels adjustment, but the techniques I'll show you using the masks panel work with any adjustment layer. The first step is to create a levels adjustment layer. So I'm going to go back to the adjustments panel here, and from there I'm going to click the levels icon, and then in the levels adjustments panel, I'm going to drag the white slider to the left. I'll hold down the Option or Alt key so I can see where to stop dragging. Now notice that all these pixels that are showing up are in the sky. I'm not really interested in them. I'm going to let that blow out completely, and it's when I start to see bits of color in the grass that I'm going to stop dragging. I'm just adjusting for the foreground right now and trying to ignore the sky. Then I'll hold the Option key down, that's the Alt key on a PC, and click on the black slider and drag it to the right, and right away I start to see some pixels, so I'm going to back off a little and release. And then I'm going to take the gray slider and I'm going to drag to the left to make the foreground of the image a little bit brighter. Now it's time to visit the new Masks panel. I'm going to click on the Masks tab here, and if your Masks panel isn't open, you can open it from the Window menu at the top of the screen. The first thing I want to do is to create a masked area that will hide this adjustment from the sky. I could use any of the selection tools, or I could paint with black or make a gradient from black to white on the adjustment layer mask. But here in the Masks panel, I can click the Color Range button and make a mask directly from here. I showed you how to use the Color Range dialog box in another movie. As I showed you there, you use these eyedroppers to select an area. And you can change your selection preview down here from this menu. I'll leave this set to black matte, and I'm going to get the plus eyedropper, and I'm going to click in the image on the other parts of the sky to try to select the entire sky. I think it will be easier to select the sky in this image than to try to select the land, because there's less variation in the sky. Now I notice that I'm starting to see part of the land here. So I want to go up to my fuzziness slider, and I'm going to drag it to the left to decrease the range of tones around those I've clicked on that will be selected. That doesn't look too bad, so I'm going to click OK. And now if I go down to my adjustment layer mask, hold the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC and click on it, I can see my mask. But this mask is upside down. I need the white part to be on the bottom to show the adjustment there, and the black part to be on the top to hide the adjustment in the sky. Let me get back to the regular view by Option or Alt clicking on this Levels Adjustment Layer mask, and then I'm going to go back to the Masks panel and just click the Invert button there. And you can see in the thumbnail that now black is on top and white is on the bottom, and in my image the adjustment is in the foreground, but the background is as it started. There's only one trouble here, and that is this transition between the area that's adjusted and the area that isn't. I need to soften that a lot. So I'm going back to the Masks panel, where there are some other features that will help me. With the Levels Adjustment Layer mask selected in the Layers panel, I could try just dragging the feather slider. And I can see the results right here in the image. That doesn't look too bad. Just to show you, if I click on Mask Edge, that opens the Refine Mask panel. I've shown you this panel in connection with selections in earlier movies. It's the same panel with the same sliders. I can click on the first of these views to see the entire image, and if I don't want to see the marching ants, I'm going to hold down the Command and the H keys. That's Control H on a PC. I haven't deselected the marching ants, I've just hidden them temporarily. So here I could use these other sliders to try to smooth out the transition between the adjusted and non-adjusted area even more. But I actually think that I like the way it looks right now, so I'm not going to use any of these, but I did want to show you how easy it is to get to the Refine Mask panel directly from the Masks panel. I'll click OK there, and there's one more slider in the Masks panel that I'd like to show, and that's the Density slider. If I take that slider and drag to the left, I'm making the entire mask a little bit see-through, so the adjustment partially affects the sky. And if you look in the mask in the Levels 1 adjustment layer, I'll Option or Alt click that, you can see that moving the Density slider has changed that mask from black to gray, and that's why it partially shows the adjustment. I'll Option or Alt click that icon again to go back. So the new Masks panel in Photoshop CS4 really comes in handy when you're working with layer masks on an adjustment layer. It allows you to feather and adjust the density of the mask. It helps you to create the mask by taking you right to the color range command. And it even will take you to the Refine Edges dialog, where you can refine the transition between the masked and the unmasked view of your adjustment layer. An adjustment layer affects the content of all layers beneath it. If you're building a file with lots of layers, sometimes you don't want to have your adjustment layer affect all the layers. Well, here's how to quickly limit an adjustment to just the layers you want it to affect by clipping one layer to another. In Photoshop CS4, clipping has become a one-step easy operation thanks to the addition of a new clipping button in the Adjustments panel. I'm going to be using a brightness contrast adjustment layer here, but this technique works with all adjustment layers. You can see in the Layers panel that this file has two layers. On the top layer are these houses, and if I make that layer temporarily invisible by clicking the eye icon, you'll see that behind it is a photo of some mountains, and I just use that for the gray sky behind. What I want to do is brighten up the buildings on the houses layer, but not brighten up the sky on the layer below. I'm going to add a brightness contrast adjustment layer from the Adjustments panel by clicking the brightness contrast icon. You can see the new brightness contrast adjustment layer down here in the Layers panel, and the controls for that adjustment here in the Adjustments panel. It's really pretty simple. If you drag the brightness slider to the right, you increase the brightness of the entire image. And if you drag the contrast slider to the right, you increase the contrast between the light areas and the dark areas. By the way, if you've been using Photoshop for a long time, you may have heard not to use the brightness contrast adjustment. That was true in the past when this particular adjustment often clipped the highlights and the shadow areas of images. But that was fixed in the last version of Photoshop, Photoshop CS3. So it's fine to use the brightness contrast adjustment in Photoshop CS4 too. So now my adjustment is affecting not only what's on the houses layer, but also what's on the sky layer below. And I really don't want to brighten the sky. All I have to do is make sure that my brightness contrast adjustment layer is selected here in the Layers panel, and then go to the bottom of the Adjustments panel and click this icon, the one that looks like a black and white circle. And that clips the adjustment layer to the houses layer below, preventing it from reaching down to the sky layer at the bottom of the layers stack. You can see that the adjustment layer is clipped to the layer below it because it is indented and it now has this down-facing arrow on it. I could add more adjustment layers on top of this one and clip them to one another just the same way. If I want to unclip the adjustment layer, I just make sure it's selected and I click the clipping icon one more time. You may remember from previous versions of Photoshop that to make this happen, you had to move your mouse over the border between the adjustment layer and the layer below. Hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC and then click. You can still do it that way if you like. But having this new clipping button right here makes this a really easy one-click operation. The shadow highlight adjustment should be at the top of your list of techniques to try whenever you're dealing with a photo that needs tonal or lighting adjustments. Shadow highlight adjusts the dark and light areas of an image separately, which makes it great for correcting backlit photos like this one. It also does a really good job on overflashed photos, which is the opposite problem to what you see here, where the main subject is too bright and the background is too dark. And it works on just lots of photos that have both dark and light areas. One thing about shadow highlight adjustment is it is a direct adjustment. There is no shadow highlight adjustment layer available. And so the problem is that if you apply it directly to a photo layer, it will permanently change the pixels of the photo. And we don't like to do that when we're practicing non-destructive editing. So here's the solution. Treat the shadow highlight adjustment like a filter. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go to the Layers panel and make sure that my lion layer is selected. And then I'm going up to the Filter menu at the top of the screen, and I'm going to choose Convert for Smart Filters. That's going to make the lion layer into a smart object. I'll say OK at this message. And you can see the Smart Object icon on the lion layer. Now I'm going to go and apply my shadow highlight adjustment by going to Image, Adjustments, and down to shadow highlights. This is the default behavior of the shadow highlights adjustment. First thing I do here is take the amount slider for shadows and drag it to the left, because this is how the image is originally. And then I click Show More Options. Let's find out what's here. You'll notice that the shadows controls are located in one section and the highlights controls in another, because this adjustment treats shadows and highlights separately. I'll start with the shadows area, and I'm going to increase the amount of this adjustment, and as I do, right away, you can see the lion is looking better. By increasing this slider, I'm just increasing the strength of the adjustment to the shadows portion of my image. The tonal width slider here controls what is considered a shadow for purposes of this adjustment. If I drag it to the left, fewer areas are considered shadows that need to be adjusted, and if I drag it to the right, more areas are adjusted as shadows. Then there's the radius slider. The way that shadow highlights works is that it looks at neighboring pixels to figure out whether it's working in a dark area or a light area. The radius slider determines the range of neighboring pixels that the adjustment will look at when it's making that determination. You basically just have to eyeball this slider. You don't want to drag it too far to the left, or everything will look flat, or too far to the right, or not enough pixels get adjusted. So just somewhere in between where it looks good to you. The highlights area has the same three sliders, so I'll drag the amount slider over to the right to darken the highlights in the image, and you can see the sky is getting more dramatic and dark. The tonal width slider determines the range of tones that will be affected by this particular adjustment. I think I'll drag that over to the left a little because I only want the sky pixels to be affected. And then we have the radius slider. Do you see that there is kind of a halo or a glow around the lion? I can usually fix that by dragging the radius slider. I'm going to try to increase radius to just smooth out that glow a little bit. When you apply a shadow highlight adjustment, you usually also have to pump up the saturation of the colors a bit. You can do that using this color correction slider. I'll drag that to the right to increase the saturation of the image just a bit. The midtone contrast slider affects the contrast or the difference between dark and light in the midtone grays, like this area here. If I drag that to the right, I get a little more contrast in that area and the photo looks better. If I had a lot of photos that I'd shot the same way, I could save all of this as a default and apply it every time. But I'm just going to click OK here. And now I have my shadow highlight adjustment. But the really interesting part is that that adjustment is re-editable because I treated it like a smart filter. So if you look in the Layers panel down here, you can see that I have a shadow highlights adjustment layer here. And I can turn that on and off temporarily by clicking the eye icon. There it is off, as the image was before the adjustment, and on as it is with the adjustment. There's also a layer mask that comes in automatically with any smart filter, and I could use that layer mask to limit the areas to which this adjustment applies, just like I use an adjustment layer mask by painting on this mask or perhaps adding a gradient to it. Don't hesitate to give the shadow highlight adjustment a try whenever you have an image with some areas that are light and others that are dark, which means almost any image really. And it's a must for backlit and overflash photos. If you were on a desert island with your computer and Photoshop and some kind of solar energy, and you could only have one tonal and color correction feature with you, what feature would that be? I'd say curves. Curves is the most complete of the tonal and color correction features in Photoshop. In this movie, I'd like to show you how to use curves to adjust contrast and brightness in an image. It's very much like making the same kinds of adjustments with levels as I showed you how to do in another movie. But with levels, you can only adjust the tonality of 3 points: a shadow point, a highlight point, and midtones. By contrast, with curves, you have the flexibility to adjust any of the 256 grayscale tones in an image. So once you're comfortable learning levels, I suggest that you give curves a try too when you're making changes to brightness and contrast. Curves are also used for color correction. But that's not going to be the focus of this lesson. In this lesson, we'll be looking just at adjusting brightness and contrast of tones. Like all the adjustments in Photoshop, when I apply a curves adjustment, I try to use an adjustment layer rather than a direct adjustment. To apply a curves adjustment layer, I'll go to the Adjustments panel here, and I'll click the third icon from the left in the top row. That adds this curves adjustment layer in the Layers panel, and it changes the controls in the Adjustments panel to the curves controls. Let's take a quick look at what's here. In this box, there's a baseline curve, which represents at the top right the brightest possible tones, and the bottom right the darkest possible tones, with all the gray tones in between. It's similar to the bar chart in the Levels dialog box, but turned up on its end 45 degrees. You can see a histogram in the Curves dialog box that represents the initial tones in the open image. You can use this as a reference, but I also suggest that you have your histogram panel open so you can see the histogram update as you make changes in the Curves Adjustments panel. There are two gradients here in the Curves Adjustments panel. The one on the bottom represents the current tones in the image, with dark tones on the left and light tones on the right. When you use curves, you're remapping those tones to other tones, and those are represented in the vertical bar here, with dark on the bottom and bright on the top. So for example, if I click in the middle of this curve, and then I drag up, notice the horizontal line that's intersecting the vertical bar on the left. What it's telling me is that the middle gray that I've currently got under my cursor is being changed to a lighter gray as I move up the vertical bar chart. I'll press Reset to eliminate that curve. And now let me quickly show you some of the preset curves that come with the Curves Adjustments panel. Those are located here at the top of the panel in this menu. I want you to see what happens when you make a curve to darken an image. As you can see, this kind of a curve bows down beneath this light gray baseline reference. And if I go up to the presets and I choose lighter, I get the opposite, a curve that bows up above the baseline reference line. And if I go back to the presets and choose increase contrast, I get an S-shaped curve, which goes up in the highlight area and moves below the baseline reference point in the shadow area. This kind of a curve is typically used to increase contrast. I'll press Reset again. And let's go ahead and make a curve to improve the contrast and brightness in this image. The first step is to go to the sliders at the bottom of the Curves panel. This white slider right over here on the right is just like the white slider in the Levels dialog box. Before I move that slider, I'm going to go to the panel menu up here at the top of the Adjustments panel and make sure that Show Clipping for Black White Points is checked. That way I don't have to hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC in order to see where to place this slider. So as I drag to the left to set the white point for the image, I go until I see some colored and white pixels. Those pixels are going to be pushed to pure white, as will everything to the right of the place that I leave this slider. I'll do the same on the left with the black slider, dragging it to the right, and right away I do see some pixels at the bottom of the screen, which are already black, so I'm going to release my mouse there. Now if I go to the Preview button at the bottom of the Adjustments panel and I press and hold, I can see how the image was without this curve and how it is with this curve. And all I've done so far is set the black and white points. Now what if I also want to lighten the entire image? I could come in and set a point on this curve by clicking right in the middle and then drag up. But in Photoshop CS4, there's a better way of customizing your curves, and that is to use the On Image control, which is located right here. I'm going to click to select that control, and then I'm going to come in my image and make some visual adjustments. So for example, let's say I want to go to this gray area over here and open it up so I can see more detail there. You'll notice when I move my mouse over that area, a small hollow circle appears on the curve baseline, showing me which part of the curve represents these particular colors. And then I'll click, and I'm going to drag up, and as I do, I am lightening this area of the image, and the curve is moving up. That also sets a point on the curve, so I can go back to that point if I want. Now I'm going to move my cursor down here to a darker area, and you can see that that's in a lower part of the curve, and I'll click and drag down to make that area darker. What I'm doing now is darkening the shadows and creating an S-curve in the Curves Adjustments panel. And as you saw with the preset, an S-curve increases contrast. That's particularly true in areas like this, where there's a steep part of the curve. To recap, I just dragged the sliders in to set the white point and the black point. Then I clicked the On Image icon and came into my photograph and clicked and dragged in areas where I wanted to open up highlights or make shadows darker. Or you could do the opposite if you wanted to. I'm going to preview the image now with this contrast curve by pressing down on the preview icon to see how the image looked without the curves adjustment layer and how much more it pops now. You can see that not only the contrast and the brightness changed here, but also the color. This life preserver is really orange now. When you make curves adjustments, you often do end up impacting color. And if all you want to do is affect the contrast and the brightness, then you can change the blending mode of the curves adjustment layer. To do that, I'll go to the Layers panel, make sure that adjustment layer is selected, and go to the Blending Modes menu, where I'll click and drag down all the way to the bottom and choose Luminosity. Now let's preview what we have. Here is the image now without that big color change, and here's how it was when I started. Much more contrasty now. As you've seen, Curves gives you a lot of control over the brightness and contrast of particular areas in a photo. And the new On Image control, paired with the black and white sliders for setting the black and white points, make curves in Photoshop Cs4 accessible to everyone. The hue saturation adjustment allows you to vary the basic color of an image and its saturation or intensity. Almost every image looks better with a little extra pop from increased saturation. You can use this adjustment alone, or maybe after you've varied contrast and brightness with another kind of adjustment like levels or curves. Let me show you how hue saturation works. Like other adjustments, I like to apply this adjustment as an adjustment layer. So I'll go to the Adjustments panel, and I'll click the second icon from the left in the middle row here, and that adds a hue saturation adjustment layer to my Layers panel, and it changes the controls in the Adjustments panel to the hue saturation controls. Let's take a look at this first slider, the hue slider. If I drag that to the right, it changes the hue of everything in the image. You can get some pretty wacky effects this way. Let me put that back. To show you the saturation slider here, if I drag that to the right, it saturates my image globally, affecting all the colors. And if I drag to the left, it desaturates everything. If I go all the way to the left, I can take it all the way back to grayscale. I'm going to reset by clicking this icon at the bottom of the Adjustments panel. You don't have to apply hue saturation adjustments to all the colors in an image. There are several ways to limit your changes to just a specific range of tones. My favorite is the new On Image control, which is located right here. I'm going to click that, and now if I come into the image and I click, say, in this blue water, and I drag to the right, I increase the saturation of just the cyans in the image. And if I drag to the left, I decrease the saturation of just the cyan colors. Let me reset that to show you something else you can do with the On Image control. Now I'm going to hold down the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC as I drag, and this time I'm varying the hue of the cyans. You can see that hue slider moving back and forth with me. Another way to limit my changes to just a range of tones is to use this menu here and to choose, for example, reds. And now if I increase saturation, it affects the reds in the image. If I want that change to affect other colors, say yellows, I'm going to take this plus eyedropper down here and click on the yellow portion of the image. And you can see that that became more saturated too. These gray sliders indicate which colors are going to be changed. The colors within this dark gray portion are targeted for change, and the colors that fall within these light gray portions on the side will partially change. They're in the fall-off zone. You may like to have a monotone effect in your image. To get that, you can go to the Colorize checkbox and click there, and then you can come to the Hue slider and drag until you have the monotone that you like. You can also vary the saturation of that effect. And finally, if you come to the menu at the top of the Hue Saturation Adjustments panel, you can find some useful presets like sepia or cyanotype. So those are some ways that you can use the Hue Saturation Adjustment layer to change the basic color or the saturation of colors in an image. If you find that the saturation adjustment in this dialog box is too strong for a particular image, or if you happen to be working on skin tones and can't get the saturation just right here, there's another adjustment that you may want to try. That's the new Vibrance adjustment, which I cover in another movie. The Vibrance adjustment, which is new in Photoshop Cs4, offers a subtle way to make colors more intense. The beauty of this new adjustment is that it uses a light touch on skin tones, and it concentrates on colors that are less saturated than others in the image, which helps even out the saturation of colors across a photograph. You might think of color as having three qualities: hue, which is the basic color, brightness, which is the lightness or darkness of the color, and saturation, which is the intensity of the color. You'll find that many color images just look better with a touch of increased saturation. Until now, the main way to increase saturation was with the Hue Saturation adjustment, which is right here in the Adjustments panel. If I click there to open the Hue Saturation controls, and I make a minor adjustment, I'm just going to pull the saturation slider to the right, you'll see that the model's skin quickly becomes oversaturated. It looks like she has a bit of a sunburn. So this isn't exactly doing what I want. I'm going to go down to the trash can at the bottom of the Adjustments panel and click it and say yes to delete the Hue Saturation adjustment. Instead, I'm going to try the Vibrance adjustment, which is right here in the Adjustments panel. I'll click the Vibrance icon, and I can see in my Layers panel the new Vibrance adjustment layer. The adjustment has two sliders. The saturation slider works a lot like the saturation slider in the Hue Saturation dialog box. It just overdoes the skin tones a bit. To put that back to its default, I'm going to type 0 in the saturation field. And now I'm going to try moving the Vibrance slider to the right instead. As you can see, the Vibrance slider is a lot more subtle. It has made the colors in the image more intense. You can see that particularly down here in the skirt, but it hasn't overdone the model's skin. If I go down to this preview icon and I click and hold, you can see how it was before I applied this adjustment. A little bit dull. And how it is with the adjustment. It just pops. That's how simple it is to increase the saturation in an image without overdoing it. Give the new Vibrance adjustment a try on your own images, particularly where you have photographs of people. Sometimes an image has an overall color cast, like the one that you see here. There are lots of ways to correct a color cast, some more complicated than others. In this movie, I'd like to show you a few quick ways to try to eliminate a color cast in a photo. None of these are guaranteed, and they don't always work on all images, but they're certainly worth a try. The first one is the Auto Color command. I'm going to go up to the Image menu at the top of the screen, and there I see three auto commands: Auto Tone, Auto Contrast, and Auto Color. Auto Color is the one to try to remove a color cast. I'll select it, and that is the result on this particular image. So that you can compare this to the original, I'll press Command-Z on a Mac or Control-Z on a PC. There's the original, and I'll press that shortcut again to show you the current version. Quite a bit better. Now, there is more to do to this image for sure, but at least I've removed that glaring yellow cast. Let me undo that again to talk about a completely different method, and that is the average color method. I'm going to make a copy of the single layer in the file by control-clicking on the layer on a Mac or right-clicking on a PC and choosing Duplicate Layer. I'll say OK. With that duplicate layer selected, I'm going to go to the Filter menu at the top of the screen and choose Blur and Average. That averages all the colors in the layer and gives me this kind of muddy brown. Now what I need to do is to get the complement of this color. To do that, I'll go to the Image menu and down to Adjustments and over to Invert. Or I could have just pressed the shortcut Command-I on a Mac or Control-I on a PC. So the complement of the muddy brown is this rather nice blue. Notice in the Layers panel that I have my photo on the background layer, and then I have that light blue on the layer above. I'm going to use a layer blending mode to blend the light blue with the photo. So with the light blue layer selected, I'll go to the layer blending mode at the top of the Layers panel, and I'm going to go down and choose Overlay. And that's the result. I don't think it looks too bad. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than the original. I'll show you how that looked to remind you by turning the eye icon off next to the background copy layer here. That was the original, and this is the result of the average method. If it's too much, I can try a different blend mode, like Soft Light, which brings back a little of the yellow. And I can also vary the opacity of the background copy layer. But for now, I'm just going to take that background copy layer and drag it to the trash can at the bottom of the Layers panel, so I can show you one more quick and dirty method to remove a color cast. And that is to use the gray eyedropper that you'll find in both the Levels Adjustments panel and the Curves Adjustments panel. So I'll go to the Levels icon here and click to open the Levels Adjustments panel and add a Levels adjustment layer in the Layers panel. There are 3 eyedroppers here, as there are in Curves. I'm going to click the black eyedropper, and with that I'm going to click on the area of the image that I want to be the darkest. I think that's right here. And when I do that, that particular color is both turned to pure black and neutralized, so that it doesn't have any cast in it. I'm going to click the white eyedropper right here. Now this is a little tricky, and I may have to click a few different times, but I'm going to try to click right on this white crack there. And that's pretty close. So that removes any cast in the highlights. And if there's still a cast in the midtones, although there isn't much anymore, I'll get this gray eyedropper and I'll find an area that I think should be gray. Perhaps somewhere over here. And I'll have to click a few times to get just the look that I want. But that just about does it. So now if I come back to the Layers panel and I click the eye icon to the left of the Levels adjustment layer, you'll see how the image was and how it is now after applying the black and white eyedropper to set the black and white points and neutralize those, and then the gray eyedropper to remove any color cast in the midtones. So those are 3 quick and dirty methods for reducing color casts in your images. I hope you give them all a try. There are lots of ways to convert a color image to black and white in Photoshop. One of my favorites is the black and white adjustment layer, because it's relatively easy to apply, unlike some other methods, but it gives you control over the brightness of each color as you convert from color to black and white. The black and white adjustment layer isn't new in itself, but what is new in Photoshop Cs4 is that you can apply it from the new Adjustments panel, like the other adjustment layers. I'm going to apply a black and white adjustment layer here by going to the Adjustments panel and clicking on this icon right in the middle. When I click there, I see the new black and white adjustment layer in the Layers panel. And the Adjustments panel has changed to show me controls for just the black and white adjustment. There are several ways to work here. You could come and just click the Auto button. But the beauty of this adjustment is that you can do it yourself, so I'm not going to go there. You can also apply a tint by just clicking this button right here. That gives you a monochrome look. And you can change that tint by clicking in this field to open the color picker and choosing a different color. So I might go up and add a blue tint, maybe make that a little lighter, and say OK. I'm going to uncheck that. Another option is to use the presets available from the menu here at the top of the panel. These simulate the effect of camera filters. So for example, if you try the blue filter, the blue sky gets light, and the red filter makes the blue sky dark. I'm going to try the yellow filter. I like the look of that, but I'd like to customize it. I could come down and change these sliders myself, just guessing at which one controlled which color in this image. But there's a better way to do it. I'm going to click this icon, which sets up the on-image controls. And now I can come into the image and just click and drag in an area, and the sliders will move with me. For example, if I wanted to darken this area, I don't have to guess at whether this is yellow or green. All I have to do is click here, and when my cursor changes, I'll move to the left, and you'll see that in the black and white adjustment panel, that yellow slider is moving, and in the image, the yellows are getting darker. If I want to lighten an area, up here for example, I'll click and I'll drag to the right. This is actually moving the cyan slider, something I might not have guessed if I didn't have this on-image control. And that's how easy it is to use a black and white adjustment layer in Photoshop CS4. It will give you the freedom that you need to control the process and hopefully give you an image that you like without a lot of hard work. The toning tools, which are the dodge tool, the burn tool, and the sponge tool in Photoshop, have always been intended to help you change the exposure and saturation of localized areas of a photo. But in previous versions of Photoshop, they often did more harm to an image than good, so Photoshop users tended to stay away from them. But these tools have been improved in Photoshop CS4, so much so that they're a really useful way of changing the exposure and saturation in localized areas of an image. I'm going to start by selecting the Dodge tool right here in the toolbox. Like a Dodge tool in a traditional darkroom, the Dodge tool will make areas of a photo lighter, and it used to do a pretty bad job of that. Let's see how it does on this photo. Before I get started, I'll check the options bar. Here I can vary whether the Dodge tool concentrates on the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights in a photo. I'll leave this at its default of midtones. The exposure determines the strength of the effect. I'm going to lower that. I like to start with it low, and then I can apply the tool successively to increase the effect on the image. The important checkbox is the Protect Tone checkbox. Do leave that checked, because that will make the tool behave a lot better than in older versions of Photoshop. So let's see how it does on this image. One thing I'd like to do is to lighten the area under the model's eyes. I'll come into the image, and I'm going to make my brush big by pressing the right bracket key. I'm just going to drag under the eyes, and that immediately makes that area lighter. I'll do the same under the brows, and then I'll make the brush bigger by pressing the right bracket key again, and I'll give it a hit in the middle of the forehead, lightening that area too. I might run the brush over the hair to brighten it. And finally, I might try to lighten the eyes by making the brush smaller and moving it over the inside of each eye. So the effects are subtle, but I really think they have improved the look of the photo. Next, I'm going to select the Burn tool, which is located in the same tool slot. As in a traditional darkroom, the Burn tool will make an image darker. So I'm going to use it to darken the background area here to focus the eye on the subject. I'm going to make the tool bigger, and I'll leave all the defaults in the options bar, including the check next to Protect Tones. And then I'm just going to drag over areas of the background, darkening them. I'll make my brush smaller with the left bracket tool to get in here and in here. Now let's try the Sponge tool. I'll go back to the tool options bar and down to the Sponge tool. And if you look in the options bar here, you'll see that this tool is set to desaturate by default. I'd like to increase the saturation of parts of this image, so I'll click on the Mode menu and I'll choose Saturate. Notice that there's a Vibrance checkbox here. This means that in Photoshop CS4, the Sponge tool is using Vibrance technology. We've come across Vibrance before as a new kind of adjustment in the Adjustments panel. Vibrance is a subtle way of varying the saturation of color. It concentrates on colors that are less saturated than others in an image, and it tends to protect skin tones. So it should be just what we need here. I'm going to come in and make my brush smaller by pressing the left bracket key. Then I'm just going to click in the eye to saturate it just a bit, and I'll do the same in the other eye. I'm going to reduce the flow by clicking and dragging to the left over the word flow. And then I'm going to run the saturation brush over the lips. adding a little saturation to the color there. I see that the model's nostrils are a little bit red, and to fix that, I'm going to change the mode of the sponge tool to desaturate, and then I'll come in with that low flow, and I'll just run my mouse over the nostrils, removing some of that red. To compare how the image looks now with these changes with the original image, I'm going to go to the History panel, go to the very top, and I'll click the snapshot at the top. So here's how the image is with the changes, and here's how it was when we started. So as you can see, you can use these toning tools in Photoshop CS4 to quickly brighten areas of a photo, darken other areas, and add a little bit of saturation where you need it most. If you shoot with a digital camera and you use a high ISO, or if you're shooting in dark circumstances, you're bound to get some digital noise in your photographs. Fortunately, Photoshop has a pretty good noise reduction filter built in. I'm going to zoom into this image so that you can see the noise in the backs of these seals. And you can see it's particularly prevalent in the shadows. To deal with this, I'm going to go to the filter menu at the top of the screen, go down to Noise, and choose Reduce Noise. I could convert this file for smart filters first so that my filter would be re-editable, but I've shown you that in other movies, so I'm going to move right on to Reduce Noise. That opens this large dialog box where I see a preview of the image. As long as the preview box is checked, I could also preview my image out here, but I just don't have room on my screen at the moment. I'm going to start by taking all these sliders over to the left to see the image as it is without noise reduction. There are two kinds of digital noise. There's the colored noise that you see here, and then there's also grayscale luminance noise, which resembles film grain. To try to reduce the color noise, I'll use the Reduce Color Noise slider, and I'll drag it over until the color noise goes away. Because that blurs the image, I could sharpen details a bit, but I do prefer to do most of my sharpening in the Sharpen dialog boxes. And if this image had been compressed in the camera or in Photoshop as a JPEG, it might have gotten some square-looking artifacts. I can try to remove those by checking Remove JPEG Artifact. But that's not the case for this image, so I'll leave that unchecked. Now, I still can see some grain here. And that's the kind of luminance noise that this slider, the strength slider, can help with. I'm going to take that slider and move over to the right. Notice as I do that Preserve Details comes on, because what this slider does is add quite a bit of blur to the image. And as I move to the right, I can see some of that luminance noise going away and smoothing out. There's an Advanced tab here too. The main difference there is that it allows you to deal with noise on a per channel basis. So you can look through the channels here to see how much noise is in each, and then you can vary the strength slider for individual channels. In most cases, you'll find most of your noise in the blue channel. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to click OK. And back in my image, I can see that I've improved the noise situation somewhat, although it's not perfect. I'll press Command-Z on a Mac, that's Control-Z on a PC, to show you how the image looked with the noise and how it looks after noise reduction. Sharpening is an important last step in a digital workflow. You have to sharpen because the very process of capturing an image digitally, either from a camera or a scanner, softens the image. And then at the other end of the workflow, when you go to print, you soften it further. Some people sharpen more than once. At first, when they capture an image, during the editing process, and then they also sharpen for final output. I concentrate primarily on the final output sharpening when I sharpen. Before I show you how to sharpen an image, I'd like to explain what sharpening does. To do that, I have this plain image of light gray next to dark gray. I'm going to go to the Filter menu at the top of the screen, and I'm going to choose Sharpen and Unsharp Mask, which is the filter I most often use to sharpen. I'm going to zoom way in the preview here so that you can see what's happening in the Unsharp Mask dialog box. This filter has found the edge between the light gray and the dark gray, and to make that edge look sharper, it makes the light side of the edge lighter and the dark side of the edge darker. That's what those bands are right here. And that's really all sharpening is. increasing the contrast at an edge to give the illusion of sharpness. So what do these three sliders do in the Unsharp Mask dialog box? The amount slider affects the strength of sharpening, and the way it does that is to change the brightness or the darkness of this edge. So for example, if I drag that slider to the left, you can see the edge becomes less bright and less dark, and so sharpening doesn't look as intense. Let me put that back for a moment to show you what the radius slider does. The radius determines the range of pixels at an edge that will be sharpened. So if I drag that to the right, you can see that there are now more pixels at this edge that are getting this lightening and darkening treatment. And finally, there's threshold. What threshold does is protect those pixels that aren't really an edge from being sharpened. If threshold is at 0, there are more lines here. More pixels are getting sharpened around the edge. But if I increase threshold, some of those disappear because I'm setting a threshold beneath which there won't be sharpening. Let's cancel out of here and get a real image to sharpen. I'm going to click in the second tab to see slipper.psd. And again, I'm going to go to the Filter menu. But before I choose Unsharp Mask, I'm going to choose Convert for Smart Filters and say OK. In the Layers panel, you can see that what that has done is to convert the slipper layer into a smart object. And because this is a smart object, I can apply my Unsharp Mask filter in a way that will make it re-editable in the future. So I'm going to go to the Filter menu again and go down to Sharpen and choose Unsharp Mask. By the way, of the choices here, the only ones I recommend are Unsharp Mask and Smart Sharpen, which is similar to Unsharp Mask but has some additional features. So I'll choose Unsharp Mask, and I want to make sure that at least one of these previews is at 100%. In fact, both of them are, as I see here and here, because 100% view is necessary in order for you to really judge the sharpening. So when I use this dialog, I usually do set amount really high, and then I vary the radius, because with amount high, I can see the effects of changing the radius. Now I never go larger than about 2. And you can see that that doesn't work in this image. Your choices for the amount slider and the radius slider will vary depending upon the size of the image. So I strongly recommend that you resize your images before sharpening. I usually have a master copy of a layered file, and then I make separate copies from there, resize the copies for whatever my output is, and then sharpen the copies. So I've got my amount, I've got my radius. I might increase my threshold here because I see that some items are getting sharpening up here that aren't really edges, these little white spots. So as I increase threshold, those will go away and won't be sharpened. I'll click OK, and that completes the sharpening. Now because I converted the slipper layer into a smart filter, I can always come back in and re-edit my sharpening settings. So if I change my mind and think that this slipper looks a little too crispy, I can double-click Unsharp Mask, and I'll just turn the amount down a bit, and that looks better. I'll click OK. So that's how sharpening works. Be sure to resize your images before sharpening. And here's a tip if you're sharpening for print. You're going to want to sharpen to an extent that looks like a little bit too much on your computer screen. And that will give you a print that's just the right amount of sharp.